I told you at the beginning of the class that I started working on this material partly because I was interested in why people were so inclined to go to any lengths to protect their belief systems. I wanted to understand, and I knew that those were systems of value, right? That a belief system is something that enables you to ascribe value to things so that you can act in the world towards things and away from things, roughly speaking. And I've already made a case to you that belief systems regulate people's emotions, but not as a consequence of decreasing their death anxiety or anything like that, or even directly decreasing their threat sensitivity or uncertainty, but more specifically by helping them orient themselves in the world so that what they do matches what they want in the social environment. And it's an important set of distinctions because the emotional control that belief systems allow is mediated by success in the social environment. That's the crucial thing. It's not directly, it's not as if you're holding a belief system and that's directly inhibiting somehow your emotional responsivity. It's more that you have a mode of orienting yourself in the world so that other people can understand what you're up to, so that you can cooperate and compete with them without conflict. And the fact that you can do that without conflict and maybe even with cooperation, that's what regulates your emotion. So it's not only the fact of the belief system, it's the fact that it's shared with everyone else. And so people are willing to defend their belief systems because they're defending the territorial structure that enables them to make sense of the world and then to act out making sense of the world with everyone else around them. Now then the question arises, what if two different groups of people have different belief systems? What do you do in a situation like that? And one answer is you capitulate. Another answer is that you fight. Another answer might be that you come to some consensus about how the difference between those different belief systems might be mediated so that you can inhabit the same territory without subordination or without conflict. But if you're going to come together in an agreement, you can't do that simply by abandoning the belief system, because the belief system is what orients you in the world. And so the negotiation is very tricky. And because of that, it often ends up in subordination or conflict. Another question that might arise out of that rat's nest of questions is, if you have belief system A and you have belief system B, and they're in conflict, is there any principles that you can use or any guidelines you can use to take the belief systems apart to try to understand what might be of central value in either of them or both, so that if you do bring them together, or even if one supersedes the other, that there's some evidence that they're predicated on principles that are actually viable. And of course that brings up the question of what constitutes viable principles. And I got interested in that more particular question because when the Cold War was raging, there were two ideological systems set up in the world, roughly speaking. There were, of course, more, but we can simplify it for the sake of argument down to two. And one was predicated on the communitarian principles that were put forward by Marx, and the other was a consequence of, I would say, Western individualistic free market capitalist democracies, roughly speaking. And then you might ask yourself, well, was that only a difference of opinion? Right? Because that's the central question. If it's just a difference of opinion, if what's underneath it is arbitrary, then A, it doesn't matter which system wins, roughly speaking. B, there's no right and wrong in the discussion, right? That would be something that would be more akin to a postmodern claim. It's just Group A puts forward their claims to power, and Group B puts forward their claims to power, and they're both equally valid, and, well, have at her, fundamentally, because there's no way of solving the problem. But it struck me that I didn't think that we should leap to that conclusion so rapidly. And so I started to investigate, I started to investigate the substructure of Western thought, not so much communist thought, because I thought of communism as an interloper on the scene. It was a system that wasn't devised and formalized until the late 1800s, and I didn't see it as part of what you might describe as organic development. There's no mythology, so to speak, at the basis of the communist perspective. And one of the things that's very interesting is that although those ideas were roundly defeated by the end of the 20th century, they're making a comeback so rapidly that it's almost unbelievable. You know, I got an email from a medical student yesterday at the University of Toronto, and now the courses that they have to take, the mandatory, these are social justice courses, include modules on equity, and equity is equality of outcome. They're pushing, people are having the equality of outcome notion pushed on them in mandatory training in universities everywhere again. And equity isn't equality of opportunity, it's equality of outcome. You know, that was the central dictum of the communist states in the 20th century. It's like, what the hell? How did we get back to that again already? So, and the idea being is that if there isn't absolute equality of outcome within an organization, that the thing is corrupt and needs to be restructured from the bottom up. And then the question, of course, is who decides that outcomes are equal, by what means and with what groups? Because you can produce an infinite number of groups of people with equally validly in some sense, and you're never going to get equality of outcome across the infinite number of ways that you can parse up society into groups. It's not even technically possible unless everyone has nothing. So anyways, these are obviously very powerful ideas, and the mere fact that they killed 100 million people already or more in the 20th century wasn't enough to put them to rest. Anyway, so back to the main theme. Is there something, this is the main question, is there a set of ideas that Western civilization is predicated on that are more than just bloody opinion? That's the question. Because if there isn't, well then, what do you do about that? It's arbitrary. You're just holding it for no reason whatsoever. It could be a different system. There's no reason to stick with it. All of those things. Like it takes the core out of it. Well, that was Nietzsche's claim, right? He said, you take the core metaphysical presupposition out from underneath Western civilization, or any civilization for that matter, and the whole thing loosens, shakes, and crumbles. Well, for Nietzsche, the metaphysical presupposition was God. Well, and then the question, of course, well, what even does that mean? And on one hand, it means, I suppose, adherence to a dogmatic set of beliefs. But then you might ask yourself, well, is there something else that it means? It means at least the hypothesis of some transcendent value. It means at least that. So, you know, Nietzsche announced the death of God. And so one of the consequences of that, Dostoevsky was working on exactly the same set of ideas. And in Crime and Punishment in particular, which is a book, like it's a necessary book. That's the thing. There's a number of books that were written in the last 120 years that you really have to read. And Crime and Punishment is one of them. And I think the Gulag Archipelago is another. And probably Beyond Good and Evil is another. But, you know, Dostoevsky and Nietzsche were writing in parallel. It's remarkable how much their lives intertwined, and Nietzsche knew more about Dostoevsky than is generally known. There's been some recent scholarship indicating that, but in Dostoevsky's book Crime and Punishment, he has his main character, Raskolnikov, decides that he's going to commit a murder, and he has very good justification for the murder, and Dostoevsky's very good at this. He puts his characters into very, very difficult moral situations and gives them full justification for pursuing the for pursuing the pathway that they're pursuing. And so Raskolnikov, he's broke and starving. He wants to go to law school. His sister's about to prostitute herself, roughly speaking, by marrying a guy that hates her, that she hates, and he has contempt for her, at least acts in that manner. He's trying to rescue his mother as well, who's also in dire financial straits. He goes to a pawnbroker to pawn his meager possession so that he can continue to scrape by. And she has this niece, I believe it's her niece, that's not very bright, who she basically treats as a slave and is horrible to. And so the pawnbroker has this money. Raskolnikov is in dire need. He thinks, look, I'll just kill her, because why the hell not? I'll take her money. She's not doing any good with it anyways. I'll free her niece, who's just lurking as a slave. She's got all these other people tangled up in her pawnbroker schemes. All that'll happen is the world will be a better place. And the only thing that's holding me back is conventional moral cowardice. And, Dostoevsky has his character in Crime and Punishment go through days, hours and days and weeks of intense imagination about this, rationalization about this, trying to justify himself, placing himself outside the law so that he can perpetrate this act, and telling himself with all the best nihilistic arguments that the only possible thing that could be holding him back is an arbitrary sense of indoctrinated morality. And so Dostoevsky explores that. He does commit the murder, and then of course all hell breaks loose because things don't necessarily turn out the way that you want. He gets away with it, however. Well, he gets away with it technically because no one knows he did it. But he doesn't get away with it in relationship to his own conscience. And so the rest of the book explores that. Well, Dostoevsky, I believe it was in Crime and Punishment, although he makes the same point in many of his books, he makes a very fundamental point. And this is the kind of point that I think that people who haven't investigated these matters down this particular literary and philosophical pathway never grapple with. Dostoevsky said straightforwardly, if there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. And that's the question that he's investigating. And you see, this is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that. I mean, it's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it. It's pure naked self-interest. How is that irrational? I don't understand that. Where's the pathway from rationality to an egalitarian virtue? Why the hell not every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost? It's a perfectly coherent philosophy. And it's actually one that you can institute in the world with a fair bit of material success if you want to do it. So I don't see. To me, I think that the universe that people like Dawkins and Harris inhabit is so intensely conditioned by mythological presuppositions that they take for granted the ethic that emerges out of that as if it's just a given, a rational given. And this, of course, precisely not Nietzsche's observation as well as Dostoevsky's. That's Nietzsche's observation. You don't get it. The ethic that you think is normative is a consequence of its nesting inside this tremendously lengthy history, much of which was expressed in mythological formulation. You wipe that out. You don't get to keep all the presuppositions and just assume that they're rationally axiomatic. To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition. Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality. Now, you could say that's a transcendent morality instantiated in the figure of God. That's fine. You could even call that a personification of the morality. If you don't want to move into a metaphysical space, I'm not arguing for the existence of God. I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and that you can't just take that idea away and expect the thing to remain intact midair without any foundational support.